Okay, so this is the next podcast on the experimental design. You probably have learned about it in previous years um, as the scientific method. I'll tell you that I don't like to call it the scientific method for a very, very important reason, and that's that what you know as the scientific method um, does not apply to all sciences. So we think of the scientific method. Here's some keywords in the targets: independent variable, dependent variable, controls, constants. All of those things um, relate to something that you know as an experiment. But not all sciences are experimental. For example, um, some that are not experimental um, could be things like paleontology. Let me figure out how to spell that. Paleontology, um, some aspects of astronomy, um, things like that, that really are more about observations and inferences, which I would argue is really the observations and the inferences is really how science is done. But if we can do an experiment, fantastic, because that tells us that one thing causes another. And so that's really what we're going to focus on in this podcast. Here are the targets. You can set up and analyze an experiment testing hypothesis using an independent variable, dependent variables. Notice that there's an S there. Controls and constants. These should be familiar terms to you. And then the second objective we're going to hit in this is that I know the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. So let's go ahead and get started with this. As you already know, there are a couple of things that we did already in class that kind of focus on this. So I'm just going to point this out. We did a POGIL on the experimental design that gives you some context. So I would highly recommend that you have that out and look at that as well, because there's some very important information in that. So I think there's some important things that we need to define. And the first is actually what an experiment is, and then we'll talk about those key terms in the first objective. So an experiment is a way to test the causal relationship between two things. So, in effect, I think you know this. You are testing the effect of one thing on something else. So, some of the keywords that you probably are familiar with is the independent variable. You can write it out. It's in the target. I'm just going to label it as IV. The independent variable is that thing that is sometimes also called, and you may have learned it as this, the manipulated variable. Sometimes you hear it as the iChange variable. It's the thing that you decide that you're going to change to see if there's an effect on something else. I'm going to give you an example of something in just a second. So that's one keyword. Another one is the DV, or dependent variable, and and this is sometimes called the responding variable. And this is what you measure as an effect of the changed IV. So you're trying to see if the dependent variable depends on the IV. So if you change the IV, you're going to see if there's a change in the DV. Something to make note of, and that in any experiment, there can only be one independent variable. You can't be changing two things, and the reason you can't be changing two things is that if there's a change in the DV, then you don't know which of the changes you made in the experiment, or the IVs, caused that change. So you need to have one IV to see if there's an effective DV, but you could have more than one DV. for example, if I wanted to measure plant growth, I could choose, so if I said plant growth, I could mean height, I could mean biomass, I could mean number of leaves, could mean diameter of growth. So there are lots of things that I could also measure it as the amount of sugar output. Lots of other ways I can measure plant growth. And you need to pick which one or which ones are going to be most relevant for your study. So for your science fair projects, I don't want something that's like plant growth. I want to see something a little more specific than that. I'm going to scoot. Let's go down, I guess. We'll go down. So at IVDV, we need a control. We need to talk about the word control. The control is, let's say, let me just tell you, it's short for control group. And remember, you got to be changing one thing in your experiment to see if it has an effect, but you got to compare that to something else. So the control group is our comparison group. So remember, you have to have two groups to test, one against the other. The comparison group is usually normal, whatever the regular condition is. The zero condition, or the group that gets zero treatment of your independent variable, or you just pick one, as long as you can justify it. You pick one as the control, okay? And then constants, remember constants, constant means same, right? Something is constant, it's the same. So constants are the things that you keep the same between the control group and the other group, which we call the experimental group. So it's the things that you keep the same. So I think you probably need an example. So let me give you an example. So let's see. So I was just thinking about this actually earlier today. My research question is something along the lines of what impact does the height of a maple tree have on seed dispersal? So in other words, how does the height of a tree affect how far the seeds spread off of the tree? Now I do have some background knowledge. I know that maple trees have those helicopter-like seeds and that they catch the wind. So I actually predict, my hypothesis or prediction, no, not educated guess, and then instead of talking about that, I'm asking you to jot this down as a question. Ask me why a hypothesis is not an educated guess in class, okay? But my prediction is that the taller the tree, the further the seeds are going to go, because there would be more time for wind to catch the seeds. There's more wind at higher heights, and shorter trees, on shorter trees, seeds are going to fall more directly straight to the ground. Okay, so that's my hypothesis. I think the taller trees are going to have higher dispersal or more spread from the base. So that's my research question. The thing that I'm going to be changing, actually I can't make trees grow taller, so the thing that I'm going to be changing between my two groups is height. Now I'm not actually going to have to use a tree, but I'm going to change the height from which I drop maple seeds. But that's what I'm going to change. I'm going to maybe say 5 meters and 15 meters from the ground. My dependent variable is the distance the seeds landed from the drop site. And the units I've been using to measure that is probably going to be meters. Okay, notice this metrics. That's my IV and my DV. So this is what I'm changing. I'm seeing if when I change the height from which I drop maple seeds, the distance the seeds land changes. Now my control group, I'm going to pick one of the two. Because maple, I'm going to pick the 5 meter height as my control. The other group, the experimental group, is going to be the 15 meter. And my constants, things that I keep the same, are going to be the type of seeds. I need the same kind of maple. Type of seeds, time of day, although these are kind of controlled variables. Time of day, humidity, wind, the amount of wind, or let's call it speed of wind, because that's something I can measure. I think you get the idea. Those are things that I don't keep the same. I'm going to drop from the same location, even though they're different heights, the same place, and I think we're good. Now, I want to talk very quickly about the second one, the qualitative versus quantitative. So quantitative is like quantity, and that's really a number. So when we're talking about how much of something, when we answer that question, we're talking about quantitative data. Qualitative data is like quality. And this really is a description. And these are things that are not measurable. So it's a description. So sometimes it's things like color or texture. And really for science fair, this is the key. You need to have qualitative so that you can do statistics, stats, okay? So you can do that. Having qualitative in addition to quantitative is definitely much better than just having quantitative. But by no circumstances can you only have qualitative, okay? But having both is definitely a good thing. So I hope you understand IV, DV control constants. There was another word in the POGIL that I did not mention here. So if you have questions about this, please ask. And that word was controlled variable. So if you don't get what those things are, which I actually described a few of the control variables. Where are we? Let me scroll back over. Some of the control variables here in the constants. But if you can't tell the difference between a constant and a control variable, please ask in class. And I think that wraps us up.